Well, welcome. Today, we got a very interesting program and a very special guest. I'm really proud to have this young man with us today. His name is Joshua Woodard, and his program is The Geologian on YouTube. And I invite everybody to go over there, show some love, and subscribe. All right. Because I believe he gives us a lot of good, fun information. And this one is going to be an example of it. The title is Evidence for the Biblical Exodus, Israel in Egypt. To introduce this program, this is Biblical Archaeology from the Ground Down, sponsored by Bible Interact. Joshua, welcome to the program once again. Glad to have you.
Thanks for having me on. It's a pleasure to be back.
Well, this time I promised I'm going to zip it and it's going to be on you. But you got your slides ready. This looks beautiful, and I'm excited. So at this time, once again, Mr. Joshua Woodard and his program, The Exodus and the Evidence of Israel and Egypt. Go to his program, subscribe, show him some love. Joshua,
Thank you.
it's on you, sir.
This was a talk I did at my local church. I had a class on evidence specifically. We're talking about Egypt and Genesis, Exodus and Genesis. And so I'll just dive right in. I hear a lot that there isn't really a lot of evidence for the Exodus as the Bible describes it in the text of Exodus. And so a lot of this idea of there not being any evidence, or at least not enough to show it, is because the Bible uses the term or the name Ramses. And so in Exodus 1, we're told that a new Pharaoh rose up in Egypt and enslaved the Israelites and forced them to build store cities. And one of those is named Ramses. And we know that in that same area, there was a city known as Pi Ramses that was built during the reign of Ramses the Great. And so I have his reign up there. And I know that the reigns of different pharaohs, it give or take a few years, depending on what chronology you're going off of. But around this time, this is when this city is constructed. And so due to the likeness of names, they usually look during the reign of Ramses the Great for evidence of the Exodus. So this is when they're going to go to the archaeology and look for perhaps a large presence of slaves, specifically slaves that are from the Levant area. They're going to look for evidence of maybe the plagues that happened during this time. They're going to look for an Egypt that is overturned, as described in Exodus. And unfortunately, they don't find that during this time. Under Ramses the Great, Egypt was one of the strongest nations at this time. And there's not a lot of evidence of any upheaval. So it seems that there is truly no evidence for the Exodus. And so we have to look at what the Bible says, though. And so if we treat the Bible as a historical text, as it claims to be, we get a different date. Rather than mid 1200s BC, we get a different date. We see in 1 Kings 6:1, it talks about it's in the 480th year after Israel has come out of Egypt. This is when Solomon begins to construct the temple in Jerusalem. And so we know right around where the temple was constructed. And again, give or take a few years, I just kind of put an approximate year there. But if you take that back 480 years, you get around 1450 BC. And so I think a more exact that a lot of historians will focus on is 1447 or 1446. But again, approximations, 1450 BC. This is the biblical date that was recorded for when they left Egypt. So you might notice that this is about a 200-year difference from the time of Ramesses. So why include that name if it's not constructed until 200 years later? And you only have a few options. Either it didn't happen the way the biblical text suggests, and they just chose a pharaoh around that time and slapped his name on it. Or perhaps it was during the time of Ramses, and Ramesses just didn't record that this happened to him and his nation. And this is a possibility because pharaohs, as well as ancient Near Eastern rulers at this time and around ancient times altogether, they didn't like to record their shortcomings very much. And so we know this especially about Ramesses because when he comes to the Battle of Kadesh against the Hittite Empire, he claims quite a large victory during that battle. But we know from the texts and the inscriptions that were given, as well as just the archaeology, that it was not a victory. It was probably more likely a draw, if anything, for him. But he goes and records it on temples and on monuments that he won and that he destroyed the Hittites. Yet the Hittites remained, and they became there became a non-aggression pact between them, and they were valuable trade partners. And so you kind of get you see where they blur the details a little bit to make themselves look better. And this is not uncommon, like I said. You also have pharaohs who like to change their genealogies to make them seem more legitimate. And so it's possible that it did happen during Ramses' time, and they just kind of scrubbed the record of any evidence of that. So I don't like that as much. I think there's a better explanation. It's a possibility, though, and there are some scholars who agree with that version. But I would like to see what happens when we look at the archaeology around the time of the biblical date. What do we see there? And so I kind of follow a similar methodology as Tim Mahoney does. And he's a filmmaker. He produced the documentary Patterns of Exodus. And this is just one in a series that he's made. But he makes this one specifically on the Exodus. Because his question was, well, if there truly is no evidence for the Exodus, as some archaeologists and scholars suggest, then his faith was in jeopardy, because that's kind of the foundation of the nation of Israel, which is the foundation of the Messiah, which leads to Christianity. So it just kind of puts a big hole in theology. And so he makes this documentary, and he interviews scholars and archaeologists from both sides. And he really tries to see, is there any evidence? And so he starts at the biblical date, like we're going to in this presentation. But I take a lot of evidence from his documentary, and I really, really enjoy it. I definitely suggest you go and watch it if you haven't. And the rest of his series on the Exodus and Israel, it's fantastic as well. Definitely suggest watching that. But when we look down in the layers of where this city Ramesses is, down to around the time of the mid 1400s, we see other layers of other cities, of other occupations here. And we see that this area is occupied by people who are from the Syria Levant area. And we can tell that because they have completely different customs from the Egyptians, especially at this time. You have Syrian style homes, so their architecture is different. They have different burial customs. Sometimes they're buried with animals or just different objects. Weapons are different. Tools are different. Their clothing is different. Everything about this area, it just screams foreign when compared to Egypt and their customs. And it matches that of a Syrian-like area. And so the idea is around this time, you had a big influx of people coming from the Levant, coming from Syria, Canaan area, which sort of matches the biblical text. And so Tim Mahoney suggests perhaps this is where Jacob and his family and where Joseph was. So like this slide is titled, "Is Joseph Been Found?" Because what is located here, and I believe the archaeologist who is digging out of Varas is Manfred Betek. He finds a small palace structure. And it has 12 pillars, 12 prominent pillars in this little promenade in the middle of it. And there's also around this palace structure, there are 12 burial plots, and 11 of them are done in the Syrian style. Like I said, you can tell a difference with these, and they're more of a Syrian burial custom. However, the 12th one is a small pyramid, which is very interesting. But it's not. We know it's not an Egyptian who's buried in it, because inside there's actually a burial statue, like a monument to the person, and it's an Asiatic individual. And so that term means this is how the Egyptians would have depicted someone who was from like the Levant or farther east. They had slightly lighter skin. Again, their clothing, their haircuts, everything was different. And this statue, it has a different haircut, lighter skin, and the tools he's holding different, like a shepherd's hook. He is not depicted like an Egyptian normally is. And one more interesting thing about him is it's hard to tell because the statue's been smashed, obviously built on top of, but they think that the statue may have been wearing some form of, it's depicted with some sort of colored cloak. They could see the pigments that's coming painted onto the statue, which is very interesting. And so the idea is there's very significant details here. You have 12 pillars and you have 12 burial sites, with one being more prominent than the rest. And so this is 12 is a very significant thing for Israel, meaning there's 12 sons of Jacob. And this is the area of Goshen where Jacob and his family settled when they came to Egypt during the famine. And you have someone who is not Egyptian, though buried in an Egyptian custom in a pyramid, which screams of his ranking, his stature in Egypt, which we know that Joseph was second in command to Pharaoh. He was given an Egyptian name. He was given an Egyptian wife. And all of this is extremely important details for this. The last thing about that little pyramid is also the bones were missing. Now, we know a lot of Egyptian tombs, especially the pharaohs, their tombs were subject to grave robbing, because you would take all the grave goods, the gold and all the other things buried with them for the afterlife. Those were stolen often. However, the bones, the mummies, were less likely to be affected. Some of them were defaced, but most of the time, especially when it was in ancient times, people were stealing things, they weren't taking the bones. There's no monetary value normally in those objects. And if you have any superstitious religious views about them, you're not going to touch it. And so the bones are missing, which also matches the biblical text, because Joseph tells his descendants, when you leave Egypt, because God's promise this is going to happen, when you leave Egypt, take my bones with you. And it's recorded that Moses does this. So this seems to suggest that this is Jacob's family, or at least where they lived, and possibly Joseph. And also around this time, you have a canal that's constructed, and it is channelizing water from the Nile into a lake. And today it's called Bar Yusuf, and it's been called that for a long time. Back then it was focused on the pharaoh who was reigning at that time. But even now, it's known as Bar Yusuf, which is it's the reservoir, it's the channel of Joseph. This is dedicated to him even today, which matches. He was told there would be 7 years of plenty and 7 years of famine. So he prepared for a famine by pooling and reserving water so he could irrigate extra fields, produce more grain. This all matches the biblical text very, very well. And this is prior to the Exodus, but we're just building a case for around this time period. And so the next portion is you have a new pharaoh that comes up. The text says a new pharaoh that does not know Joseph, because Joseph and his family were held in high regard. But now you have a new pharaoh that doesn't know them. And so a big question is why? Is you'd think that their family would be pretty prominent. Well, this might match up well with a group known as the Hyksos. So the Hyksos are a short time period of rulers who are foreign. And again, they're from the same region as Jacob and his family. So the Levant, Syria, they're definitely foreign. They're Asiatic. And so what's interesting is they make their capital Avaris, which is where this palace structure was. This is where Jacob and his family and Joseph were. And so, like I said, it's about 100-year rule, and eventually they're going to be pushed out by the Egyptians. But why I bring them up is so it's more of from what I've read, it's more of a peaceful takeover. You just have more and more of them filtering into the city, into this area as they're migrating to Egypt, and eventually they become so prominent they just expel the Egyptians. Well, it seems like that Joseph definitely came during a time of Egyptian rule. He's given an Egyptian name. He's not given a different name that would be related to the Asiatic individuals or the people from the Levant. He's given an Egyptian name. He's given a priestess or his wife. Like, all of this is very determined. It seems to be very close to something related to Egypt. And so if they're going to take rule, put themselves as pharaohs and expel the actual Egyptian rulers, Jacob and Joseph and their family, they're pretty friendly with the Egyptians. So we don't want them to rise up against us with the Egyptians and expel us. We just took control. So it would make sense. We're going to enslave friends of the Egyptians and use them to build a store city right there on Avaris. They make that their capital. And so why is it called Ramesses in the text rather than Avaris is a big question that kind of goes against this. It's possible, rather, it's just an anachronism that it was Avaris originally written down. But as the text is copied over time, and we know that every new king that comes to power in Israel, God commands them to have their own copy of the law. They're to know it, they're to read it day and night, and they're to have this, and they're to know it. And so it would make sense as scribes and copyists are going over this, like, wait a second, Avaris doesn't exist anymore. Nobody knows what that city is. And they update the name. They update it to Ramesses, which is what it would have been called later on. And we know that Jerusalem used to be called Salem, and many other towns are like this. And even Moses does this. He adds parenthetical statements. Like it was this town, which is by this river as you pass this landmark. Like these are added in. So it doesn't seem like a big deal to just change the name. It's the same place, just different time period. So to me, Ramesses is just an anachronistic name. And instead, Avaris was ruled by the Hyksos, and those are the individuals who possibly enslaved the Israelites while they were there. This can change depending on if you follow a short or long sojourn in Egypt. But I think there's some good evidence for this. So during the Exodus, though, so that was leading up to the text of the Exodus and right at the beginning, there is some evidence in the middle that showing towards it. So there is a manuscript known as the Admonitions of Ippawar. Now, this is dated to the manuscript we have is the only extant text for this, and it is dated right in smack dab in the middle of when the Exodus would have happened. Now, some scholars think that it was a copy of something written a few hundred years earlier, but the description that it has and the fact that it dates to the right time period to me shows that that's not the case. So it talks about plagues that are very similar to the biblical text. And so it talks about blood. The Nile is blood, and that they're digging around the Nile to try to find water. And it's all the water's still blood. Talking about hail and fire raining from the sky. Some of these details seem to match up, and not all of them do, but it seems very interesting that the Pharaoh probably wouldn't record these details, but his scribes and his officials, who even in the biblical text ask him, like, hey, what's wrong with you? Egypt is being destroyed. Maybe they would have recorded it. So it's possible. I'm not going to be dogmatic about this one, but it just seems pretty uncanny that these details match up pretty well. So I think that that's very possible here. So then this leads to, well, who was the Pharaoh then? Who was the Pharaoh of the Exodus? And my guess, this is going to be Thutmose III. And so his reign I have up here ends at around 1425 BC, which is a little off from the 1450, 1446 of the Exodus, which I'm fine with. Again, give or take some years. There's also the high and low chronology that different scholars agree with. And if you take the other one, it puts his reign ending right around the Exodus, which would be even better fit. Either way, it's something, another interesting portion about him, which is a key fact if we're going to match it up with the biblical text as a historical text, is his firstborn is Amenemhat. He dies early. And there's not many details about him. We know that he was given a pretty high position of authority over the cattle, Pharaoh's cattle, and that he was over the cattle could be used for religious use. So it was an important position, but he just dies, and he's not talked about anymore. But this is key, considering the angel of death that's described to come through in the Exodus kills Pharaoh's firstborn son. So this would match up. To try and match this up, you do need a Pharaoh who loses his firstborn son. And so there are some possible problems with this, with my guess here. He was one of Egypt's greatest pharaohs. And so this is similar to Ramesses, because Ramesses the Great, again, The nation was very, very strong at this time. So wouldn't you expect there to be a lot of destruction around this time, and it wouldn't be very powerful? So we'll mention that in just a second. And he also lives, like I said, if you take the other chronology, he lives after the date of the Exodus and the Red Sea crossing. So some individuals who have their guess on the Pharaoh would suggest he dies in the Red Sea. And so it has to be someone whose reign ends fairly abruptly. I disagree with that. I don't think the biblical text records his death. It talks about the horsemen of Pharaoh and his chariots, his soldiers going in after the Israelites in the Red Sea, and they're the ones who are drowned. There is a psalm that talks about Pharaoh and his oppression they've been shaken off of the garment of Israel as like a symbol of his oppression has been removed from Israel. I don't think that again necessitates his death. I think the goal was to crush Pharaoh's oppression, crush his control over Israel, and show Pharaoh that he's not God, at least in the theology of the Bible. So I think that I don't think that's really actually an issue with Thutmose. The Pharaoh after him. So this is also going to matter to the argument. Thutmose III's son is Amenhotep II. He defaces Thutmose III's co-regent and stepmother, Hatshepsut. He defaces her monuments. So this is possibly important. The more I read up on this, I might have changed my opinion on this slightly, but it's possible that she, being in the court earlier, that she was possibly responsible for Moses. That he was raised in the Egyptian fashion. He was raised in the court of Pharaoh. That her birth date doesn't match up perfectly for when Moses would have been adopted. Again, chronology, if you change it slightly, might fit better. But it is possible that she was mothering Moses in some regard and teaching him, and that this could have been a motivation for defacing her monuments. I don't think it's because she was a woman. It could be something religious in mind, but she seems to have helped Thutmose III do a really good job with Egypt. So it's possible. Again, I'm not going to be dogmatic about that one, but it is a possible motivation. We also know that Amenhotep II leads campaigns into Canaan, which is a little odd, considering Thutmose III controlled this area. And so his father, just prior to him, and even while he's a co-regent with his father, he controls this area. He dominates this area. And he leads a raid up into Canaan. And he records this, and he talks about taking a large amount of weapons and chariots and, most importantly, slaves. Almost up to 100,000 slaves. He writes this down. And he takes a ton of stuff with him. Again, this is really odd. If you control this area, why don't you just demand tribute? Well, it would make a whole lot of sense if his father just lost their star army and all of their chariots in the Red Sea, and they all died, and he needed to kind of replenish his army. And it would also make sense that he took all of these slaves to replenish the forced manual labor that he also lost as the Israelites left. Because this vast slave grab doesn't happen like this elsewhere. Like, yes, there are records of slaves being taken, but this is big. Like, this is a lot. So it's a little odd. And so, although Amenhotep II, again, I will agree, he probably won't record, hey, all these plagues just happened and we lost our army. You're not going to publicly write that down. It doesn't seem very good for your legacy. But he almost does by writing that he took all this down and kind of boasting about himself. And this is not really that big of a deal. It's not like he took over another nation. He just went on a raid and took some stuff. He's boasting to make himself look more powerful, but he's replenishing himself. And he's hinting at the fact that maybe the Exodus did just happen. He lost his army, he lost his labor force, and he's replenishing that. Another thing is that he's making a lot of peace treaties rather than going to war. Thutmose III was spreading the boundaries of Egypt further and further beyond other pharaohs. But Amenhotep doesn't continue this. But he was at a position he could have continued to expand the boundaries, and instead he makes treaties. And this might also hint at the fact that he doesn't have the power to do that right now. We just lost our army. We don't have the economic power or military power to do this. I'm going to make treaties rather than war. So I think all of this hints at the fact that something big just happened right before his reign, or maybe right at the beginning of it. And so we've gone through before the Exodus, we've gone through maybe some events right during, right after, and here we're going to have definitely after this time period. So there are these set of letters known as the Amarna letters. And so these letters are named after the area that they're found in. And it's this huge cache of clay tablets, and they've been written on. And I have them dated at 1390 to 1330 BC. This is approximate. So this is towards the end of Amenhotep's reign, but also they're normally known for, this area is normally known for Akhenaten. But what's something interesting that they mention is this group known as the Hapiru or Apiru, and they're specifically in Canaan. So you have these vassal states in Canaan, these different kings and governors who are over these different city-states, and they're sending letters back to Pharaoh saying, hey, here's some updates about what's going on. And a lot of them talk about this group that's coming through and destroying cities and taking over territory. The Apiru are attacking us, and some of them mention that, like, the king of Hatzor is like, hey, they're attacking, I don't know how much long we can hold out. And then other letters record that Hatzor has been given over or even gone in cahoots with the Apiru. And so what's interesting, though, is that Pharaoh doesn't send help. From what I've read and the correspondence that you can see, he doesn't say, yeah, I'm going to send an army up there. And so if that's true, that he doesn't, it's again possible that he doesn't have the ability to do so, that he's back home still trying to rein in what happened during the Exodus, and that he's not focused on them. And so this is also interesting. I think that the Apiru, and I'm not the first to say this, that these might be the Hebrews, that this is when the Israelites fully come into the land under Joshua, and they're going through attacking different cities like Jericho and Ai and Hatzor, and that they're capturing them and burning them and taking territory, and that this is who they're talking about. And we know from other inscriptions and other manuscripts that the Hapiru are considered their own ethnic group, that there are certain pharaohs who would consider them to be their own people. It's not a nation, like not a settled nation or a civilization, but they're considered their own ethnic group by these letters, which is very interesting. Later on, that term, I think from what it looks like there, it's kind of applied to brigands, maybe some marauders, but at this time they're considered to be their own people group. The Apiru are attacking Canaan. And so then I want to look at some cities around this same time. So if they're coming into the land after 40 years, this is going to be right at the end of the 1400s, and their first to attack is Jericho from the biblical text. And so this is a drawing. This is Kathleen Kenyon's findings. I've taken this, though. It's from Dr. Wood's writings, Did the Israelites Conquer Jericho? A New Look at the Archaeological Evidence. And you can find that on Associates for Biblical Research. But this is a really interesting diagram and drawing we've got here. So you can see, I don't know if you can see my cursor, this black stones stacked on top of each other. You would have had another portion of wall on top of that. So this is a retaining wall, and you had a wall on top of that. And going up here, this yellow embankment, you had a secondary, a larger wall up here. And so this was a double-walled city that the Israelites were coming up against. And this is just daunting. It's massive. And they're walking around, it says God was telling them to walk them around 7 times, right? And then the walls came tumbling down. What's really interesting, what we find is that these down here below the retaining wall, you find rubble of both walls, and that it's the bricks. It's almost like they've rolled down the hill and formed this ramp leading up the embankment into the city. And this is exactly what the text says. The text says that the walls came down and Israel went up and into the city. They didn't break down a gate and go into it. They went up and into, which seems to match. They went up this ramp, that the walls came down and provided them perfect access into the city, and they burned it to the ground. And so that's very interesting. And so also the date that Kathleen gives is earlier than when the Israelites would have arrived. She gives it, I think, up to 150 years prior to. And so she suggests the reason why is because they don't find any of the Cypriot bichrome pottery. And so this is a specific pottery that you can date to the time. It should be there if it was during the time of the Israelites. It was her suggestion, and she says she doesn't find any. Well, we know from previous excavations they do find some of this material. I think it's Garstang's excavation of the city that he does find it. He finds this bichrome ware, and even other archaeologists. I believe that Dr. Wood himself, he does a lot of these kinds of analysis. He's gone over the findings, and yes, they were found there. Seems like Kenyon's excavation was. She didn't do a vast excavation. It was a pretty specific location. But regardless, yes, that has been found, and it dates it perfectly to around the time where the Israelites would have been here attacking it. But there are some other important details that match up. The walls were destroyed was one. The city was set on fire, which matches. They burned it to the ground. But specifically, underneath this massive layer of ash that we find, is you find grain and other loot just sitting beneath it. And you can see this picture. And again, this is from Kenyon's excavation, still through Dr. Wood's article. You see these jars full of grain. And this is really odd because during a siege, these often took months, perhaps years. And so you'd need to feed the army. And so when you took this city, you're going to take whatever's left over to replenish what you have. They didn't take it, obviously. And this is around the time of harvest if it's this full, which again matches the text. They were told not to take anything. They were told to burn it to the ground and leave it there. And it was right around the time of harvest. And it matches the date. So the Israelites come out of Egypt, and after 40 years in the wilderness, this is where they go. So you also have evidence post-Exodus that this is matching up. And so why all this matters, and this is why I gave the talk originally at my church, is if God's word is true, the historical events should match. And it seems like the details match up really well. I won't be dogmatic about the name of the pharaoh. There are many different views. And again, it depends on a long, short sojourn, if you think it happened during Ramesses or not. But you have a lot of really good evidence, as I've just presented, that matches up with the text very, very well. And so we can use this to show that, yes, this was written as a historical text. They recorded it well. And this is an event that is very true. And this is how Israel began. And so it strengthens our faith. It equips us to defend this word, the word of the Lord as well. So thank you for giving me the opportunity to present that. But that's what I found, evidence before, during, and after the Exodus that suggests that, yes, it did occur, and it happens around the time of the biblical date.
You said Thutmose III, which would be the 18th dynasty.
Yep.
Which would place us into possibly the 15th century, right?
Correct.
BC.
Yes.
And the second one you mentioned, of course, was Ramses, and that would be the 19th dynasty and would place us into the 13th century. So hopefully this is what's a lot of scholars debated for years, and of course it's still out there.
Yeah.
But where you date the Exodus, not you, I'm just using you in general, where anybody decides to date the Exodus, another 1446, using the biblical literal date from First Kings, or there's a suggested date that goes all the way back to Albright, I believe, 1920s or 30s, in which he placed it into the 13th century. And he was looking at archaeological evidence
Right.
In Israel. This is just to help out the audience a little bit, because if we put the Exodus at 1446, of course, that's going to change the date. Well, not change the date. It's going to have a variant in the date of the conquest as well.
Right.
So you're going to give a time, let's say, once again, literal 40 years in the wilderness. So we got to take 1446 minus 40, puts us around 1400 BC, and then the conquest for Joshua in the land of Canaan. But if we go with the time period of Ramses, let's say, I'm just going to round it off, 1260 minus 40, which I don't know why they do that. I'm just going to throw something out because we got a little bit more time. if I'm not going to take a literal date, and I'm going to go by archaeological evidence, put it that way, by let's say from the time period of Albright, and we say okay, 1260, then why turn around and take a literal date of wandering in the wilderness? Because you just would, if I do that, I'm not taking a literal date to begin with. Does that make sense?
Yes, yeah, and there's a I think you're kind of hinting at it too. There's the theory that the 480
Yes.
years that they divide that by a specific number, which matches like 12 generations. And so it's like or 10 or something along those lines. So it's a symbolic number, which puts you still within Ramesses. I think it's a few too many hoops to jump through, in my opinion, because it seems like Solomon is all of that time period where he's recording how many cubits and how many baths were in the sea and all these different things of the temple. It seems odd that he'd give everything very specifically, and then this one's symbolic. It seems like he's writing it down specifically to record this is exactly when it happened.
Right. Well, I think what happened with the adjusting of the date in archaeology is that in the hill country, it appeared that they were building on virgin soil in their early settlements that dated to the 13th century. So academics, and I'm not saying it's wrong or right, this is just what happened, is that they're trying to adjust and reason with the biblical date. So with 1446, it says, what, 12 generations. And if a generation is 40, Albright turned around and said, a generation usually isn't 40, it's more like 26 or
Yeah,
25. So now he goes 12 times 25 or whatever, 12 times 26 as the average lifespan of a generation in the ancient world. All this is very, you know, reliant on trying to fit the biblical date with where they found archaeological typology, the study of pottery in the land of Canaan. That's why we got the two. That's
yes,
basically why we got the two. And you did mention that, but I just wanted to fine tune it a little bit for the audience
sure,
because if we got an early date, we're going to have an early conquest. If we got a late date, we're going to have a late conquest.
right,
And we could throw in, for instance, the Merneptah stela that dates to, and they fluctuate a few years on that. I'll just give it like 1208 around there. And it mentions Israel for the first time outside of the biblical text.
right,
And then it has what we call determinatives, which means that, hey, guess what? It's not a nation. They don't
right,
have a king. It's a people group. Maybe a loose tribal confederation that's becoming united under an umbrella called Israel.
right.
And but anyway, maybe this helps the listening audience to when you were talking about both pharaohs and why that is so important in what you were talking about. A great lecture. You talked about Avaris and Manfred Vitok. That was the excavator and how he found in an excavation a Semitic tomb.
Yes,
Uh, and with that, a Semitic statue of an individual, male individual wearing Semitic garb. And it kind of reminds me of the Beni Hassan painting, if you will, wall painting. You remember that one. And it shows Semitic people entering into Egypt.
right,
And
yeah,
they're carrying with them their tools, their weapons, such as it looks like it's called the duck's bill axe. And then they have donkeys and mule donkeys. And on it is a bellows. And I think it's very important because, in a way, early in the biblical text, even in Genesis, it talks about the people of Canaan. They were the forgers of metal.
mm, yeah,
And what do you do with the bellows? And then you take it into Egypt. So you got a reason for being there. You got a skill. And that they migrated into that northern Nile Delta, as you said, and they became very populous and they became so, you could say, numerous, if you will, that they kind of ousted out the native Egyptians in the capital for Egypt at that time of the Hyksos period, at least of Avaris, in the 17th century would have been Thebes, like 200 miles south. And the Hyksos capital would have been in Avaris. And it was, I think I read it was probably the largest city in the ancient world at that time.
Wow.
And so, if anything happened in Avaris, because it was kind of like on not just on the Nile, but it had tributaries, and eventually those would dry up. They silt up and they dry up. And if something happens to Avaris, that population would have to disperse.
Right.
But anyway, hopefully it was totally interesting. And I wanted to put some other information in there for the listening audience. If they want to go into more detail, they can look up the Israel stela or the Merneptah stela. They could also
Right.
look up the Beni Hassan. It's not an inscription, it's a wall painting, but just look up Beni Hassan. And Hassan is more like the sons. Ben means sons. So the sons of Hassan.